Welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, episode 15. Couple of changes tonight. First, for regular viewers, you might notice slightly different proportions here. I bought a new webcam a couple of days ago. I've been kind of meaning to for a while. The last one was 720 in its resolution. This is higher definition at 1080, so hopefully should be a slightly better quality. The only problem is it's also slightly wider angle, so we're getting a little bit more of the background here. And if I had this sitting where I had the last one sitting, in fact you'd probably get most of the room, which isn't really worth putting in. So if I've got it sitting a little bit closer to me, it does mean my hands become huge when I start gesturing though. So coming up tonight, the main photo I'm going to be talking about, I just flick over. No, not that. Where do we go? This one. So this is called The Artists at the Nail Factory. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So I'm going to be discussing that picture, what went into it, the story behind it, but also what's kind of interesting about that one is the lighting effects. And how we sort of set about trying to solve the problems for that. And then additionally, well, because with that photo there are, I'm trying to emulate natural light, but I'm using artificial light to do it. I'm going to talk around that subject as well, give you a few more insights into how you can use artificial light. And then, of course, we'll be doing the critique section at the end, or the second half of the podcast as well. I've got a couple of pictures being sent in, going to sort of talk through ways that we can sort of look at them or take different angles on them and stuff. So that I'm quite excited tonight. I think it should be quite a fun program. The other difference is you might notice just sitting down here on the left there is buy me a coffee. And this is kind of in response. For those who've watched the last 14 episodes, I talked about that if you fancy making a donation, paypal.me/Kim Ayres. You can still do that if you wish. But a little bit of feedback I got was there was a slight problem. There were people who sort of wanted to make a wee donation, sort of help support these podcasts. But then kind of got a bit stuck saying they weren't really sure how much, and they didn't want to sort of offer too little and seem insulting, but they didn't want to the whole thing maybe got a little bit confusing. So the thing is with Buy Me a Coffee, go to buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres, and essentially it becomes the price of a cup of coffee, about £3. So, and if you want, you can buy more than one. You can buy me 3 coffees. It all depends how generous you're feeling. You don't have to buy me any. That is purely optional. It's always appreciated though. So that aside, let's move on to the tonight's program. So let me flip over then and start talking about this picture here. So this picture is called Artists at the Nail Factory. And the reason for that is because it's a group of artists and they happen to be in a gallery called the Nail Factory. Now, the Nail Factory is a tiny little gallery in Dalbeattie in southwest Scotland. Now, Rupinder here, she's her and her partner Peter. They own and run the Nail Factory. Now, if you go there, I mean, it is really small. I mean, it looks kind of like a sort of not much bigger than a brick shed, to be honest. But back when Dalbeattie was sort of quite industrial, there was a lot of stuff going on. I can't remember exactly the dates, but pretty much a couple of 100 years ago, that was where they made the nails. Now it's sitting in the garden of Peter and Rupinder's house. And several years ago, they decided to use it as a gallery space, and it's a beautiful little space. They 2-3 times a year they have different exhibitions. There's local artists exhibit there, not so local artists exhibit there, and they're a lovely couple, and the artists want to kind of come back again and again to it. So that was the space. but it was quite small, and I'd been having a conversation with Rupinder for quite a while. She'd been thinking about the idea of what she really fancied was as getting a shot of artists in that space, something she could use for publicity and promotion. The basic problem, though, first of all, it's like, what are you going to do with them? The space isn't very big, but also you need to have a time when a whole load of artists were available. So what happened? This was coming up to, we were into autumn at this point, and I was chatting away with Rupinder, and on the last day of November, she was going to be, was the end of the season for the gallery. All the artists were going to be turning up and taking their work down. So she knew there was going to be, a large gathering of artists. In the end, I think there were 2 who couldn't turn up on that day, but the rest of them did. And then Rupinder, part of what the kind of hospitality of the wonderful local gallery, Rupinder also, when all the artists turn up, they take down their stuff, but then she puts on a wonderful spread of food and turns it into this beautifully social occasion. So we knew there were going to be people there, so that was when. So we then started sort of, well, what ideas could we do for this? And actually, the original idea we had, well, what was it? The first idea, we started talking about if you were placing the artists about, obviously you don't just want them sort of all standing there sort of grinning inanely. I wanted to try and create some kind of narrative picture out of it. So the thought then was, maybe you could have them standing, you could have, the painter standing at an easel, you could have a potter at his wheel, you could have sort of somebody weaving in the background with a pile of willow next to them. And, but very quickly it just kind of felt too cluttered for one thing, and very contrived. Mind you, having said that, contrived is a bit of an odd word really, because this is contrived as well, but all the work that I do, any stage narrative is contrived, but I suppose it's by degree, isn't it? It's whether you're looking at it and you're going, oh, that's an interesting photo, or you're just looking at it, just looks like a bunch of people standing around. Maybe it's a very subjective thing, but it didn't quite feel right. We revisited the subject a few times, played around with ideas, and then one of the things, I can't remember exactly how it came up, almost a kind of an accident, a throwaway line, but it turned out that Rupinder had a real fondness for the kind of Dutch old masters style of painting. And so we kind of latched onto that, and so I think, well, okay, what if we were to sort of take that idea, not recreate one exactly, but use the tropes, the ideas, the concepts, the lighting style and what have you of that. How would we go about it? Anyway, the idea, it started to become quite interesting. And we thought, well, what could we do with that? So we started then thinking about the artists that we had. I started, using Pinterest, wonderful resource. So we started pinning images and how could you get a group of 7, 8, 9, 10 people into one space. And in tables are great devices. These are why they crop up a lot. I mean, there's obviously the most famous kind of Da Vinci's Last Supper. This isn't obviously anything like that. But the fact that he has them seated around a table is a device, a way of getting a lot of people into one picture, where you've got something that anchors everybody, and then it allows you to move your eye around the table and investigate the other people that are going on. So that idea that was going on with Da Vinci 500 plus years ago then found its way, right through into the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries of art as well. So it's an old thing. It's an old idea. So, well, what if we were to do that with photography? And then what if we were to have some aspect of each artist with the tools of their trade? You didn't actually necessarily have to have a big easel. But, I mean, so in the case of Phil here, he has paintbrushes sitting in his pocket. Some of them a bit more obvious. Peter's literally carving stone. Doug Fitch, potter, or Doug and Hannah, the potters. Doug's showing off one of the pots. So, some of them are more obvious, some of them slightly less so. But what you've got is you've got that gathering around the table. Now, I think one of another interesting bit then is, well, what are you going to put on the table? Because you could, of course, do a nice big spread of food, but then that, well, apart from the fact that that was going to get quite complicated, if you look at a lot of these old paintings, they don't always have a banquet sitting in front of them, unless it's very specifically a banquet shot. What you have is that sort of shared snack food. So you have fruit, you have bread, you have cheese. It's the kind of things you will sort of eat bits of while you're talking, while you're chatting. So social food in a way. So we started thinking about, okay, well, maybe we could start doing things like that as well. So we lay it with that kind of food, and then we sort of went round, and again, just to sort of introduce you to there we go. So we've got over here, this is Jeff Forrest. Jeff Forrest is a willow weaver. So we've got him weaving a bit of willow here. Peter, stone carving. Rupinder, gallery owner. Doug and Hannah of Fitcher McAndrew. They've cropped up in other pictures I've talked about in previous weeks. And of course they had their wee baby Fred with them. They also had their other wee daughter Pippin as well, but at this point she'd run off. Trying to keep two kids on her lap was just a little bit too much. What I love about Fred here is, by coincidence, I mean, you can't hope to direct, babies and toddlers, but he has that look of the kind of little cherub or imp even that you sometimes get in the kind of older paintings as well. You can also see he's got hold of, Hannah's got hold of a little willow star here, which was essentially to keep Fred occupied, which Jeff had put together just to keep him. We've also got Erwin over here, Erwin van 't Hoff, who's a jeweller, and he's got some of the jewels of his trade. And then Caro Barlow, a glass artist. We have one of her beautiful pieces of glass, and she's got some of her tools down here as well. So that's how we kind of spread out the artists themselves. But then what the stuff that we put on the table. So we've got bread, we've got fruit. Now we've also got pomegranate that's been opened and an orange with peel coming off. Now I'm going to come back to the peel thing, but that was quite fun. In a way, part of what this is doing is acting almost like a kind of mini still life. Again, that kind of old master Dutch painting where you're taking fruits and stuff, and so you're creating like a little mini still life really in that part. We've got cheese and bread and some chestnuts over here because it was obviously coming up to Christmas. But then what we've also got is we've got inside information as such, little bits of extra things, layers of meaning. So one of the things that Rupinder wanted was she wanted to have an inkwell with a quill. And you can see here a pheasant feather, going into a little inkwell here. And the point for this was that there's a writers group would meet in this space every, I can't remember whether it was weekly or monthly or whatever, but it was a regular place for writers. So she wanted to have reference to that. And it's one of those things that I love. In a lot of the old paintings that you have, there are extra little layers of details which you might miss on first glance. And some of them you might not even realise what their meaning is unless you're an insider. And then there was just a tiny little inside joke, which, unless you really know what you're looking for, there's a little piece of paper sitting here which says, may contain nuts. And that was just something Rupinder wanted to have in there. And it's part of, to be honest, it's part of what I love about these constructed staged narrative photos that I keep getting drawn to do, is if you're going to create a scene, you can put anything in that scene. It's created. So you have the option to add extra little bits of information. And whether that's for people to stumble across by accident, or whether it's just a little in-joke, or whether it's just something which you feel adds a tiny little extra bit of meaning or warmth or story element to it is up to you. So a kind of fun thing to do. So this is kind of where we were then with the, so we've got the people and we've dressed the table, or we've worked out what we were going to have on the table. The biggest problem of the lot, though, was going to be the lighting. And the reality is that, of course, when the old masters in Holland were doing their paintings, there was no electricity, there was no artificial lighting. So virtually all the paintings are either done by natural window light or by candlelight. Those were pretty much your options. So if we were going to sort of emulate the feel with this, we were going to have to copy that kind of lighting. We were going to need shadows being cast as though they were. And this was going to be particularly tricky because it was a very small space to begin with. And it also had white walls. Now, in a small space, having white walls is great. It reflects the light about the place and it allows you to show off the pictures, and it gives the place a slightly bigger feel than it actually is. But for photography terms, it was a bit of a nightmare. Because if I shoot off a flash in a room full of white walls, it's going to bounce off every single wall. I mean, it's a little bit like here. I've got a light source coming from just off to one side here. It's hitting the white walls here, and there's a large white patch behind me. Honestly, I mean, I could have stuck a big black cloth behind. It'd be too much trouble. I don't think it would make that much difference to these podcasts if I did. But you can see how the white sort of reflects off. And so there was a real problem with the potential for the white bouncing off all over the walls with this one too. So first thing I did was I set up a big softbox. Now, I'm just suddenly realising I was going to shove in an extra photo, which I realised I do have one. Where are we? Yeah, let me show you this little lighting test shot. So you can now see how I was attempting to set, so the main thing was up in the top left corner here. You can see what I've got is I've got a big softbox. I can't remember exactly how big it is, wider than me. It's 120, 160, 140 centimeters, something that kind of, that kind of size anyway. But so there's a big softbox there. There's a flash inside it, and that's shooting light down onto the table with the idea of it being something like a kind of like a skylight. And the other thing was that I've got a grid across it, and what the grid does is it stops the light splaying out so much and narrows it down. So as you can see, what it's doing is it's pushing the light down onto the table without throwing it up all around over the walls so much. And then the next light to do was I wanted to have the candlelight. And if we go back to here for a moment, you can see we've got the candles here, and you can see there's a sort of slight orange, there's a warm glow around everybody's faces, and you can also see the shadows coming up on the wall. So the assumption is everybody's lit by the candles. But anybody who's ever tried photographing candles will know full well it just doesn't work like that. You do not get enough light. And in fact, actually, in the critique section, let's come to a bit later, Vigi has sent in precisely this problem where she's tried to take photos of little candles and it's been particularly troublesome. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a wee while. But for this, so the way I decided to get around this was to take an off-camera flash, which I then put an orange gel across, and I tucked it behind the fruit bowl. So if I zoom in here, now you can now start to see that actually the candlestick is actually lit from underneath. The hot spots are coming from under. There's a little bit of shadow here, and there's a very bright patch down on the table. So that patch isn't from the candles coming down, it's from the fact that the flash is just literally behind the fruit bowl. So it's that flash which is then lighting up all the faces. But that on its own wasn't fully getting it. It did mean that Caro and Erwin over on the left got missed out. So that was where the importance of having the skylight, the softbox over in the top left corner coming down, because it helped fill in some of the shadow here. Also, likewise, Fred and Hannah were getting a little bit lost because they were sitting behind Doug from the direction of the light. So by having those two light systems, that kind of worked, except for the fact that it meant that the table, the front of the table, was completely black, because there wasn't any light coming. The light from the left was coming straight down. The light on the table was on the table. So all this bit down at the front and just under the table, these little bits of detail here, were completely lost. So what I then did was I had a third light, which you can see reflected in this picture here. So this is a photo, and it's got a glass front to it, so it's actually reflecting. And essentially, just sort of back out of camera reach, obviously, down just slightly above table level, or probably about my kind of chest level, really, I had a strip box on a low power. And then the idea for that was just to sort of lightly fill in the shadows. So you can now see that this then is a 3-light setup. We've got the gridded softbox up here. We've got the flash behind with the orange gel behind the fruit bowl, and we've got that bit, the strip softbox, to use as a shadow fill. So when we go back to here now, that allows me to bring out a little bit more detail and get the feeling of it being you can see under the table as well. And so that was really how we went about it, you know. But there's one final aspect to this as well, which was quite interesting. I'd done the editing, taken it to a level whereby I felt it was almost this. And it still looked very much like a photo. Although this does still look like a photo, there was something missing. And again, if I flick over to here, quite apart from the editing, you can see from the quality, it's just got, well, this is a web-sized version, so we're losing a little bit as I zoom in, but it's still got the way the colours reflect and are, you know, whereas painting the paint reflects colours in a very slightly different way. And then also, if you've got an older painting where the varnish has faded, you know, has sort of turned slightly yellow as well, there's other textures going on, and there's the texture of the canvas as well. And I was sort of stuck with my picture for a while. And in fact, let's just show. Did I have? Yes. So I'd got to this stage. This was really what I wanted to show. Yeah. So I got to this stage. Now compare that to. Let's close that one. This. Now, okay, I'm brightening. You know, there's a little bit of playing around with lightening and darkening, but it's more than that. When we look at this photo, we zoom in, it still looks very photographic. The way round this was what I did was I got a bit of extra texture, just literally a little texture file, which I then overlaid. And where you can really see this now is if I come up into here, you can see we've got these extra layers of texture, and it's just a subtle thing. Likewise, it finds its way down into the shadows down by the table legs as well. And that little kind of textured overlay just sort of gave it a sort of slight canvassy feel to it. And just, you know, well, for my mind at any rate, the difference then between this and this is really noticeable. It just, you go from this where you go, oh, and if you'd only seen this, you might have gone, oh, okay, yeah, I can see Dutch old masters using lighting tropes and what have you. But you move to here and it just shifts it up a next level. So, you know, back to the editing process is always a really powerful part of any image that you're doing. That little extra layer of texture is what really made the difference with this one. So that was kind of what I wanted to talk about with this. It remains, I mean, although this is 2.5 years old, something like that, it still remains one of my favourite photos. I mean, part of it is, and it's always this when you're doing group photos, is crowd control. You know, there's such an element whereby you are dealing with everybody else. Another bit of backstory for this was shot on obviously 30th of November, around St Andrew's Day in Scotland. And it was cold. It was a winter's day or winter's evening. And now you can just see in the background, you can see there's a little stove pipe going up here, because behind them was a little wood burning stove. And knowing it was going to be cold, Peter had gone in a couple of hours before I turned up and lit the wood burner. Unfortunately, the way the wind was blowing and bits and pieces means that when I turned up and knocked at the door and had the little chat, and then Pete said, "Okay, let's take you out there," and grabbed all my stuff, and we went across to the back of the garden to the nail factory. Opened the door, smoke came billowing out. It was just, you know, the smoke had just been filling up the whole room. You could not see the back wall, even though it's quite a small room. So Pete sort of disappeared into the darkness, put the thing out. We were opening all the doors and the windows and what have you. So we managed to eventually clear all the smoke out. However, it was only 4 degrees centigrade, which is what about, roughly about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. So it was cold, and you know, again, everybody was sort of really, you know, we've all got layers on. A couple of people sort of took off big chunky coats just for the photos to be taken, but you can see they're kind of keeping their fleeces on and as many layers as they could think they can get away with. So yeah, that was kind of fun. But then we've also got problems with, I mean, you know, we've got a baby in the picture. In previous earlier shots of this, we also have the toddler, that baby's big sister as well. There's a certain amount of chaos. Peter decided that he was going to be literally carving rather than just pretending to carve, so he was hitting the chisel into the sandstone. Some of that, I found out later, was hitting Jeff in the face as well, so he's trying to keep a straight face rather than start snarling at Peter. So it was, you know, there's a lot of it's funny, I put this picture up today on Instagram, or yesterday on Instagram, just sort of to say about the fact that this picture was, I was going to be talking about this picture tonight, and I've had a couple of comments from people who were involved saying you were always quite amazed that I ever managed to get this picture, because our memory of it was it just being this incredibly chaotic event, whereas it looks all beautifully calm. So yes, the idea the camera never lies, total and utter bullshit. The camera never tells the truth, especially in constructed narratives. We're telling stories, we're not telling truth, we're telling stories. We might tell deeper truths with those stories, but we're not telling literal truth. Philosophical conversation for another day, perhaps. So part of what I wanted to talk a little bit about here was the notion of the lighting, anyway, and that notion of using. A few weeks ago, I talked about. I showed this picture, and this was one of the first pictures where I started using coloured gels, and what I'd done here was I had for this picture of Rebecca, over on the left of the picture, I had a speedlight flash going off, which I put an orange gel on, and over on her right I had a flash with a blue gel on. And because again you can't see the flashes, you assume she's kind of lit by the candle. When you look closer, you see that the candle is in fact lit on its left hand side as well. So you know, you can tell that there's a light source from the other side, again with the edge of the mirror. But this was like the first one I'd done. But I liked that effect, and so that started feeding its way into other pictures I did. Then a couple of years ago, I think it might have been a year or so before I did The Artist at the Nail Factory, I did a photo shoot for a thing called The Lost Chronicles of Galavidia. It was a historic group, and it was about interesting historic figures in Dumfries and Galloway. There was a whole project going on, and we shot this in Bittle Tower down near Dalbeatty, which has got this sort of carved vault kind of cellar area. So this, in a way, was a kind of precursor. You know, I was sort of, again, we had a small, really small, tight space. At this point, I'm fitting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people into that space. You use a table. And at this point, a wee little thing about the food, because what was wonderful involved in this project was Fran over here. And Fran, it turns out, was involved as one of the food designers on Game of Thrones. And so I'd been along to one of the talks she'd given about designing food for all these, all these people sit down to banquets when you're watching it, but somebody had to design the food. And each of the different, if you've watched Game of Thrones, or if you haven't watched it, it's obviously fantasy kind of medieval style thing, but you've got all these different houses, you've got political groups and small kingdoms, people in the north, people in the south, and each of the different kingdoms would have different kinds of food that they would eat, just in the same way that the UK diet doesn't tend to be the same as the Mediterranean diet, which is slightly different from a North African or a diet, or different from an Asian diet, or many different Asian diets. So she was talking about different kinds of food, and what was wonderful with this was she just got in charge of dressing the table, and she was talking about fruit, and she was the one who came up with, she said, this curl of orange peel and the open pomegranate. There's another part of the open pomegranate over here, and it just sort of added an extra layer of texture. So when we came to do the Nail Factory shoot, stole that idea completely. As you can see, it's not an apple, it's an orange, but we've got the curl of peel and we've got an open pomegranate. So grab ideas wherever you can. So this one here, what I wanted to do was, we've got these large candlesticks over here, and we've got candles on the thing. So in reality, I've got a large light, again, just off to one side on my right, which has got a sort of yellowish gel on it, so sort of kind of give it a yellow glow of candlelight. In the fireplace behind, I put a flash with an orange gel, so you can see down here it looks like there's a kind of an orange glow with the firelight, and then behind them, that's actually what's lighting up the roof, or the ceiling, the stone ceiling here. But if you just have the yellow light on, or orange yellow light on its own, it sort of just can drain it, so you need something else to cut through. And like the picture of Rebecca, where having the let's just show you that, this one here, when I put the blue light in, not only does it beautifully complement the kind of orangey yellow light on the other side, it almost ends up with a slightly moonlight feel to it. So I put a blue flash just inside the little window here, which is then catching, well, the back of his jacket here and the edges over here. So, and you can see it down also with the musician on the floor. So that kind of acted as a bit of a colour balance. And let me show you a couple of other pictures from this, because I then did a set of individual portraits. So we've got Cathbad here, the monk, and again you can see the fruit here. It's very much a straight on kind of picture, but you can now start to notice that we've got this sort of yellow glow coming from here. You can see the orange firelight from behind. We've got the blue coming in from the window. Similarly, when we put the musician back up on here, we've got much more fire now. You can see the way the light is bouncing around the fireplace, but it is just a flash, but it really does give the feeling of it being firelight. This one where we have Matt all dressed in chainmail, taking from the side, we've got the edge of the firelight over on the right, we've got the candles, and we've got more of the blue coming through that little sort of small window here. So you can see then that even though it's supposed to look like a kind of window light, evening night window light kind of coming through there, and there's a firelight and there's candlelight, all of it is artificial. All these places, well, you know, in this case it was in a very dark dungeon, sort of cellar basically, and at the nail factory it was taken in the evening in winter, so there was no natural light. So getting the hang of artificial light is a fun thing to do as well. It opens up your palette, it allows you to do a lot more things. And then, but you can also play, I mean, in a very different kind of photo again. If I should show you this one, this photo I did for Narelle. Now, she is a luthier. So she makes and repairs stringed instruments, and this is an entirely different photo shoot I did. I just wanted to pull this one in because with this photo we wanted to have a relaxed sense of her with a cup of coffee and the studio behind her, and like a kind of morning light coming through the window, as though she's, you know, going to start the day after a cup of coffee. It was a dull, wet, miserable, cold day. There was no sunlight. She did have blinds, but there was no sunlight. So I had to put a speedlight flash on a stand outside the window, and we adjusted the blinds so that you could get the stripes coming across, and then I fired that, and so, you know, we can see the way the stripes sort of fall up here. Again, if you know what you're looking for, the giveaway is that the lines of the stripes, which are fairly horizontal up here, as you go down the picture, become more diagonal. And if it was sunlight, it wouldn't happen. All the lines would be absolutely parallel to each other. The fact that they're not parallel and they sort of gear down like that is a sign that there's it's just a flash. It's a smaller light just outside the window doing that. At different points, I mean, I think I've talked before, I will talk again probably in more detail about if you're wanting to deconstruct photos and see how people have done it, you know, you look at the lighting, follow the shadows. The shadows tend to be the big giveaway for 99% of how somebody's lit something. So that's really kind of what I wanted to talk about with that. Something I've realised I absolutely forgot to say right at the beginning, which is Facebook. I'm doing this live on Facebook. I would like your comments. I should have said that at the beginning, because quite often when I don't say that at the beginning, I then don't get any pictures coming through. So we'll flick back here. I will just take a quick little look in here, see if we do have any. Oh, Alison's come in. Thank you, Alison. New webcam looks great. Always enjoy your comments and skills on Photoshop, etc. Oh, thank you, Alison. Much appreciated. Okay, yeah, so I should have said back at the beginning, please leave comments. You know, let me know you're here. If you've got any questions, any points, throw them into the comments. And, you know, I will periodically keep sort of looking in to see what's going on. So that's really what I wanted to talk about, that photo, and talk about the lighting and how it was constructed, and that notion of using artificial light to echo natural light. I suppose really one of these little things talking about is there's a lot of I come across photographers sometimes who will call themselves natural light photographers, as though somehow it's superior. Now, there's nothing wrong with natural light, and in a lot of ways, and almost just what I've been talking about, is you know, an awful lot of artificial light is about emulating natural light. If you can get the natural light, then that's fantastic. But every time somebody's called themselves a natural light photographer, what they've usually meant is they've never learned how to use artificial lighting. I mean, it can be said, it's really difficult because I'm not trying, I really am not trying to do anybody down. If you're using, I mean, everybody starts off as a natural light photographer. We all do. And if you don't need to go beyond, if you're doing landscapes, you're only ever going to be using natural light. If you're doing wildlife, you're only ever going to be using natural light. And that's brilliant. But if you want to start doing stage imagery, there comes a point whereby natural light isn't enough, because you are limited then to particular hours in the day and particular weather patterns. And if you live in Scotland, where during the winter it's much darker, you'd have far fewer hours of light, and generally speaking it tends to be much wetter than, you know, whether that's in England or Europe or, you know, various other parts of the world, then if you are stuck with natural light, you are extraordinarily limited. So learning how to use artificial light, it's more tools in the toolbox. It gives you more to play with, more tools, a wider palette to explore with. And I suppose the reason I kind of bring it up is because I know myself, I started off natural light photographer because we all do. But I was always drawn to portraits, and I wanted to take photos of people. And using window light, you know, north-facing window, beautiful light, lovely light, you can't beat it. But what happens when the sun goes down? What happens when it's a dark, dreary day and you've had to whack the ISO up too high so everything just looks too grainy? And I was scared of using light. I remember I got myself a lighting kit, and I got to use static lights for quite a while because at least I could see where the shadows were falling. But then that also meant that I was always stuck near, I had to be stuck near a power source because I had to plug them in. And then, so there came a point, probably a good 2 years before I started using flashes and speedlights. I kind of knew I needed to, but I was scared to because I didn't understand them and I didn't know who to turn to for them. Eventually I had to watch so many YouTube videos, which is great because, you know, YouTube is my online university. The reality is I'm self-taught. I didn't go to college or anything to learn these things. So anything I want to learn, I've got to go out there and find out how to learn it. I then did question friends. Most of the people I knew locally didn't really do that. Mostly I tend to know landscape and wildlife photographers, which isn't very good for learning how to use flashes. But I had a few online friends who were, you know, able to help me with that. Occasionally when I've opened up to my studio, I've had people come in almost sniffy at me for using artificial light with a kind of, I'm a natural light photographer, used in a way as though I use natural light, organic light, free range light, none of your artificial additives, thank you very much. I suppose it's those people I'm at. If I'm having a go at anybody, it's people like that I'm having a go at. People who've got this kind of inverse snobbery, and all it means is they never learned how to use artificial light. I mean, if I can use natural light, I absolutely will. And a lot of the photos I've shown you over the last several weeks have been a mix of natural light and artificial light as well. If you've got natural light sources, absolutely use them. Doesn't make you superior, doesn't make you inferior. But what I would say is you need to, if you're wanting to develop your photography, well, if you're wanting to develop the kind of photography which requires photographing people, photographing indoors, photographing in places where, then learn how to use the artificial lighting. And again, if you've got questions, ask me. There's a lot of information out there. Right. Okay. What do I want to move on to now? So let's move on to the critique section. And the first thing I'm going to talk about, I think, is Diana. Yes. Let's start with Diana. So let's pull up this picture. So just a quick reminder for anybody who's tuning in for the first time, we're now moving on to the critique section. So I have a Facebook group called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Join that, easy enough to find, just type that phrase in to Facebook, you'll find it. And then if you want me to give any critique or feedback or answer questions, then place them into the Facebook group, and then the following podcast I can pick it up and look at it. Now, this photo by Diana, and she said, recently joined this group, been catching up with previous videos. Got a lot from them. Thank you, Kim. Well, that's nice to know. Thank you. The title of this photo is Rain Stopped Play. As I was working for that feeling of being trapped indoors by the rain. Does it work? If not, why not? Any technical tips? And what about shutter speed? Okay, so there's quite a lot in the question, quite a lot to sort of play around with here. So rain stopped play. We've got a couple of tennis balls. We've got wet ground. We've got raindrops hitting. So we can understand the story, you know, which is important. Question then is, what can we do with this story to improve getting the message across? Now, the first thing that's noticeable about this, I think, is that it's not particularly in focus. I mean, there is a little sharp bit of focus just around here, sort of. I should again say to anybody who's watching this for the first time that people have posted the picture in Facebook, so I've only got a low resolution version of this. Some people email me the high resolution versions of their pictures, which gives me a little bit more to play with. That's always a possibility as well. In this case, it's a low resolution, so as soon as I zoom in, we've obviously lost any detail that was there. However, the ball, both of the balls, we can see from the fuzzy outline, that is not overly in focus. So it might have been in focus when seemed in focus, or from when I don't know whether this was a camera photo or whether it's a camera and you've zoomed in. So it's not that sharp, and I don't know what your shutter speed. Maybe your shutter speed was a little low. Difficult to tell at this point. But then again, it might have been quite fast given the fact that you've captured this droplet. Without actually having the full knowledge of what your camera settings were, it's a bit difficult to comment on that completely. But let's give you some general ideas with this. 2 tennis balls, rain stop play. First thing that strikes me, I suppose, really, if you're almost making that kind of, summer, we're at Wimbledon season, or would have been if it had not been stopped because of COVID-19. This might have been quite interesting if it had been on the grass. Having said that, if it had been on the grass, you wouldn't have had such a sense of wet paving stones, and you wouldn't have had the bouncing of the droplets of the rain either. So you're weighing up here where you're getting the strongest visual effect against maybe the overall story. The fact that this is on paving stones, so you get, okay, this is in the garden. Rain stop play is then more a case of we didn't get out into the garden to play, rather than rain stop play as in the full-on tennis story idea. The next thing that I'm struck by is the fact that the balls are more or less at either side of the picture, so there's a large gap between them. And I've talked about this before, I know, but in pictures gaps get exaggerated. Now, if you imagine standing at your back door looking out at this scene where you've got a couple of tennis balls on the paving stones, they're going to look almost next to each other. I mean, they're only maybe a foot, 18 inches apart, something like that. And in your field of view, which will be going from a fence to another fence or something like that, that gap is only taking up about 5%, maybe 10% of your field of vision. But you can see here that with the edge of the photo just the one side of one ball and the other edge of the photo just the other side of the other ball, this gap between them is actually taking up about 60 to maybe 70% of the photo. So that gap has become massively exaggerated. So the first thing I would really say with this is, one way of doing this story is to pull back, give it more space, allow the balls to be closer to each other within that space. So that's one way of going about it. Now, what you also did was you said, this is, you also sent in a cropped version, just wondering whether that was any better. So this is then taking the story in a different way, which is instead of it being about two balls in a space, we've now zeroed in on one. And because we've got one here and then we've got this beautiful droplet just bouncing back up, that then becomes much more of the story. It is a shame that things are kind of a little bit out of focus, and I don't. It all depends on kind of what your settings were. But what you've asked about here is a couple of technical tips and shutter speed. So let's flick back here where we can see this. Two things then that I want to suggest to you, Diana. First off is about the notion of photographing rain. It's very difficult to try and capture it if the light, depending on where the light source is. The best way, without a doubt, the best way of things looking like rain are if you've got a dark background and you've got a light source behind it. Now, unfortunately, I don't seem to have any photos of my own which I can show as examples, which is a real shame. And several times over since you posted this, it started to rain outside. I've noticed it started to rain outside. I've gone to grab my camera and then it stopped raining. So I've not been able to. I was going to take a couple of photos just to try and illustrate what I mean. But in essence, because the rain is very fine, or and you've got and is transparent, or refracting the light around it. If you've got a pale background, so it's raining and you've got a grey sky behind it, you point the camera at it, you just do not see the rain. It doesn't really matter how hard it's raining, you're not going to see it. Rain against a light background doesn't work. Rain against a dark background does, providing you've got another light source. And if your lights, so sometimes you get the sun behind the rain, but the sun is raised, but you've got maybe a dark wall or wall in shadow below. And if you are photographing the rain such that there's the dark shadow behind it, but the sun is out of shot, but is shining through the water, through the rain, you get the most beautiful effects. You really do. And I would really suggest this, Diana, and to anybody else who's watching, look out for that. Next time it's raining, and especially if there's a bit of sun about, see if you can find a way to get the sun behind the rain, but without pointing the camera at the sun, obviously. But with the camera pointing through the rain with a dark background. And if you can do that, it becomes quite magical. So that's part of it. The second bit of this, which is shutter speed. Shutter speed is quite crucial because there's two different ways you can go down this route. You can either go for a slow shutter speed or a very fast one. Now, the slow shutter speed means that while the shutter is open, click, click, during that time, the raindrop has travelled quite a distance across your field of vision. As such, you end up with a smear, you end up with a length of it. And if you've got a lot of rain coming down, then you end up with lots of lines all smearing down over it. So that looks very rainy. If you have a high shutter speed, then it captures the droplets. The droplets, click, click, very quickly. Then the droplets haven't had time to move across the screen very much. So you don't get the rain blur. You don't get that smear, smudge, blurry effect. Instead, you capture the droplets individually. And that's a very different kind of look. There is a whole form of photography to do with catching droplets into water. And it's not something I've done. I do know people who've done it, and maybe at a future point I'll do a little thing, or maybe I'll even invite somebody on, do a wee interview with somebody I know who can do this, to talk about that. And what they do is they take this idea and ramp it up, or rather they put it under laboratory conditions where you have a tray and then you have a almost like a pipette or something which is going to drip your droplet down, and you have a high speed flash to catch the bounce of the drip hits the water and the little bits come up, and you try and freeze that motion, and it becomes very sculptural and really quite beautiful. So shutter speed then, Diana, is down to the effect you're trying to get. If you want to get more of these kind of absolute catching the splash, then you want a high shutter speed. If you want to have more of that kind of blurred, streaky lines, then you want a slow shutter speed. So I hope that helps. That gives quite a lot of different bits of information within that. But if you play around with these ideas, then I think you'll be able to take your story and ramp it up a few levels. So I hope that helps. Right. Have we got any other comments? Oh, Diana's come back in. Shutter speed 100th of a second. Yeah, so again, if we take that idea, if you had it down to a 25th of a second, 20th of a second, 10th of a second. Now at this point you probably need a tripod or to have it resting on a table or something like that, but you need the camera kept still. That's when you would get the lovely kind of long streaks. On the other hand, if you if you took it up to say 250th of a second, 500th of a second, you would find that you would be really capturing those droplets. So that's the way to kind of play around with it. Now, you then need to offset that balance with maybe your aperture, how much light you're getting in, and your ISO, but that's a different kind of thing. ISO 450, all right, you put up an extra bit, ISO 450, 85 millimeter f5.5. Okay, so you're working in quite a dull light. Well, I suppose it would have been if it's just kind of a wet Scottish day. Maybe it's not Scotland, I'm not sure quite where you're based. 85 millimeter, okay, right, 5.5. Yeah, so if you were to take it up to 250th per second or something like that, you probably have to get a wider aperture. You might have to up the ISO a bit, but it would be worth playing with that. Or like I say, going the other way, narrow your aperture, increase your ISO, and slow down your shutter speed and get more of a smear. But the biggest thing that I think is going to make a difference with that, apart from focusing in exactly the right place you want, is where the lighting comes. And really, if you can, try and get some kind of backlighting to the rain, and then you'll really see it. So hope that helps. Oh, you're in Wales. That's even wetter than Scotland. Okay, brilliant. What else we got? We got Mandy here saying, when I started college studying photography, Kim, I fell in love with the studio and lights. I now enjoy using both natural and flash with my photography. Yeah, I think it is, Matt. Yeah, I think you're right, Mandy, that once you start getting the hang of the studio lights or off-camera flashes and things like that, it just adds a new level to what you can play with, and it allows you to go off and explore other things. Obviously, if you don't have those kind of things, you take it at your own pace. There is this whole thing, talking in a different context, but very recently, about the idea we are all running our own race. We're not. It's like when you've got a big marathon run going on, you've got the handful of people who are there trying to beat the world record. Something like the London Marathon, tens of thousands of people enter. A lot of people, they're just trying to do it within their own time. That's, can I do it in 4 hours instead of 4 hours 20 minutes? They're beating their own time. And some people are dressed up in costumes. As long as they complete, that's fine. And some people, if they manage to complete it at all, and it takes them 12 hours to do, they've got a sense of achievement. Your sense of achievement is we're not all trying to do the absolute best. What we're trying to do is, we're trying to do the best for us. Wherever we're at, we're moving at our pace. Wherever you are at, there's plenty you can do to take up to the next level at the point you're ready. At the point that you start either getting frustrated at the limitations of what you can do, so it's what can I do to shift up to the next level, or you get excited by the idea of, oh my god, I've seen this really fancy effect and I want to be able to do that. What have I got to learn in order to be able to do that? So, okay. Right, next picture then. I'm going to move on to VG. And now VG has similar kind of problems, but with an entirely different medium. She's talking about flames. So she sent me a little set of photos. I'll just quickly run through it. So we've got a candle here, and she says, these photographs I took Saturday. Out of my comfort zone, brilliant. Yet wanted to try some indoor photography. I'd taken close to 40 photos. The half candle eventually melted out. These were taken mostly with the natural light the candle provided. So what we've got, just show you here, we've got this picture, we've got this one, and so we've got a candle pot with a lid, which features in a couple of the pictures and not in others. This one's slightly out of focus, this one's in sharper focus, this one's in focus, but really bright whiteouts and stuff like that. So what she goes on to say is, the interesting, where are we? These were mostly taken with a natural light the candle provided and also with an external source. Okay, I'm not sure what your external source was, whether that's natural daylight or another lamp. It's not really showing up what your other light source was. The darkness inside the flame near the wick that we usually see was mostly missing. Yet, I enjoyed capturing the golden orange hues with the warmth the light brings to the table. Please let me know if I missed out on any details or a better way to capture the flame/light/shadows. Thank you. Now, we are on to here, extraordinarily difficult kind of thing to do with capturing flame. The fact is that flame gives out an extraordinarily bright light, the fire, right at the point where it's lit. So, down here at the wick, just above that, we've got that flame there and it is completely whited out. It's overexposed, we've not got no detail within that. But it is lighting up the inside of the pot, and we've got the handle here, that's lit up. By the time we get to the wall, which really only looks like it's a couple of inches behind that, the light has almost died off completely. And this is the tricky bit, is that actual candle flames really don't give off very much light. You have to have a lot of candles to be out. When we look at these movies set in Victorian, Georgian, medieval times, and and all these grand halls are lit up by candles. That's not how it would have looked at all. They're lit by studio lights, and then there's a lot of candles around doing exactly the same thing that I did with the artist at the nail factory. Artificial light, you put the what looks like the natural lights, the candles, in the shot, so the eye gets drawn to the shot and everybody goes, aha, that's obviously where the lighting is coming from, but the real lights are just out of shot, and that's the actual reality of what's lighting everything up. So your basic problem here is how to expose for it, because if you expose to get the light, if you want to get the flame, you want to have the literal orange-ish of the actual flame itself, you need to have a high shutter speed and a very low ISO, and quite possibly a narrow aperture as well. And you will just have to play with this VG, because obviously it depends on the strength of the candle and the other lighting as to how that's going to work. But you go to that, and at that point you will probably get a flame that looks like what you think a flame looks like. However, at that point, everything else is going to be black. You're not going to see anything else other than that flame. If you want everything else lit up by the flame, you then expose for everything else, but then the flame itself becomes overexposed. The only ways around this are you either sort of do 2 photos from the same spot with different exposures, or maybe multiple photos with different exposures and overlay these, though it's always going to look slightly false. or you bring in another light source. So essentially what you do is you play with your camera settings, with your ISO and your aperture and your shutter speed, and you take it down and you expose your camera for the flame at the level you want that flame to show. Okay, so if you don't want it whited out, if you want that orange part and you want that darker patch just down by the wick, then you expose for that. When you take the photo, everything else will be blacked out because it's not enough light. So you then you introduce your second light source. You introduce another light source, and whether that light source is window light, whether it's a flash, whether it's a few bright lights, however you want to do it, but you then have to fill in the rest of the light with another light source. And that's really the only way to do it. You can't, the camera is not sophisticated enough, at least the level of cameras that we've got, to be able to capture the flame in all its beautiful, glorious detail. And again, you're talking like the water, a high shutter speed. I mean, it's like photograph a fireplace, you know, or an outdoor fire or something like that. You know, a high speed shutter speed will capture the flame, will freeze these kind of little movements and circles and rolls of flame. A slow shutter speed, the light smears, you get stretches of it flying out. So yeah, it all depends how. If you want everything else lit up, try not to don't let the flame of the candle itself really appear too much in the photo. If you want the flame, then you have to expose for that, and then you have to light everything else around it. So I hope that kind of makes sense to you, VG. Gives you a little bit of a better understanding. But it's get in and play, you know, and play with multiple light sources. See how you get on with that. Okay, so last photo I want to come on to this evening is from Paul. So Paul here says, here is a photo I took of the new V&A interior. So the V&A is the Victorian Albert up in Dundee in Scotland, over on the east coast of Scotland. Very stylish building. I was trying to capture the various interesting angles and textures. I liked it best when I converted it to mono, and here's his cropped and black and white version of it. I would be interested in your thoughts. Okay. So this is, presumably then this is the original photo. And then, okay, let's just clear out some of these other ones here so I can see what I've got here. And yeah, and then we've got your black and white. And it looks like what you've done is just basically literally crop it off pretty much about the same amount either side. So it looks like this is cropped pretty much into the middle and you've made it square. So the fact that what you've done is you're going for the interesting angles and textures. See, there's a number of different ways. When we look at the original here, what we've also got is we've got people. But obviously the people are, you know, this blurred and hidden behind here, cut off up here, blurred and hidden behind here. Elbow or something sticking. Yeah, it looks like somebody's probably just leaning on it, chatting over there. So there are people in it, but that's not what your focus is. Now at this point then, first thing I would say really, Paul, is if it is about the lines and the angles, then in an ideal world you needed to wait until people weren't there, or you use your best Photoshop skills to try and remove them, because the people then are a distraction from what you're trying to do. The minute you put people into a photo, the eye gets drawn to them. We are human, socially evolved mammals. we cannot help but turn to look. If there's a person in a photo, doesn't matter how big or small the photo is, if there's a person in there that's noticeable, we kind of can't help our eye being drawn to them. So our eye gets drawn to these. Now, I am aware that when you put that into black and white, the people become slightly less obvious, but they are still there and they do still act as a bit of a distraction. So if you decide, right, what I am concentrating on here is line and form rather than people in a space, then you best as you can try and make sure that there are no people, or if there is a person and you were hanging. I understand the frustration. You could be sitting, I mean, if this is a popular museum, you could be sitting there for 4 hours waiting for there to be nobody on the stairs at that point, and that just gets frustrating. But there are places where it's probably easier to remove people in Photoshop. Maybe you've only got a couple of people and you can, so that's your first point. The next point is how you crop it, really. I mean, you converted it to black and white, and I understand now, we talked before about the great advantage about cropping to converting to black and white is it then brings your attention to line and form. Line and form trumps colour in that case. And if it isn't, if the colour is an important bit, then you don't convert to black and white. So the fact you've converted to black and white means that it is about the line and the shape that you're going for. So actually, I'll tell you what, let's open this with Photoshop. Okay, suddenly realised I didn't open Photoshop earlier, which I meant to, so you bear with me for a moment just while this springs up. But I mean, first of all, if you're converting to black and white, a few episodes ago, I talked about 4 or 5 different ways you can convert to black and white. If you go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kim Ayres, you can find not just the full programs, but I've done a few bite-sized chunks where I've taken particular techniques and just cropped that out. And I've got a bit on there which is about 4 or 5 ways to convert to black and white. So the standard way to convert, is you just take your hue saturation slider and desaturate. You haven't done that by the look of it. You've got more, so I would guess what you've probably done. But actually, let's just quickly open that in Photoshop as well. Yeah, so that's your version. You've got more contrast than my one. So I reckon you've probably done a gradient map. I do gradient map. Zoom that in. Yeah. That's looking virtually identical. So you've done the gradient map. That allows for a bit more contrast, which just a straightforward desaturating doesn't. There's also the option here, if we went to the channel mix, red, that changes it. Green, that's a bit different. Blue, that's different again. So you might want to get in and just play around with them. Again, at this point, I'm not going to say right or wrong. This is about what you're chasing. You've got particular ideas of what you're chasing. So I'm just offering up other options. Do maybe play around with the channels, because you can see the blue channel there gives quite a different feel to the red channel, which is different again from the green channel. So do you want any of those, or do you want to add a gradient map on top of one of those? So that gives you extra ways of playing with it. But there is another interesting thing here, which is how you've cropped it. Now, I do have to say, one of the first things that strikes me with this and with this is it feels slightly tilted. Now, I think I got a little bit of feedback from somebody last week that was I just obsessed with sort of straightening photos, and I kind of feel the same thing here again. And I seem to remember, Paul, that it was actually your photo last week of Alison doing the knitting, where what I said, I could see what you'd done was you had anchored the strongest vertical to a line that was on the side of the picture. And you've done the same here. You've cropped in and you've anchored the strong vertical over here on the left. But what has happened here is because of the slight distortion of the lens, is that the lines as we go across, by the time we get to the middle part here, it's starting to tilt to the left a bit. And you can see over here, if I grab a line and drag it across, whether you can see that, but this line here, we can see that this vertical isn't straight at that point. And it is over here, but it isn't on that side, and nor is it in the middle. And I would really seriously be very tempted. I just want to nudge this just a little bit there, like that. And I want to create, I feel that there's, is this going to do this? I think I've got too many programs open at the same time. There we go, thinking about it. So I just want to, actually I want to make the strong vertical this bit in the middle. I tend to feel that that's what is really kind of, because the lines, let me show you. We've got, let's see the pencil tool, we've got the lines, let's turn that to white. Strong diagonals coming down here, strong diagonals coming down here, we've got diagonals coming up here, diagonals coming down here. Basically everything's sort of moving towards this point, and especially this big white patch here. That's what draws the eye. So because your picture is tilted that way, you've anchored it over here, this bit doesn't quite feel right. So I would immediately just, I want that bit to be straighter. However, there's another thing here which I want to, let's go back. Let's play around with the larger version. Because if you're talking about lines, okay, let's just do the gradient map. We've turned it black and white in the same way that you have. One of the problems we've got here is that we are distracted by the people. A way round this is, what if we invert the image? I'm going to do image rotation 180 degrees. Quite a different photo. Quite a different photo at this point. And because we're sort of drawn to looking at the top half of it, we maybe don't notice the people so much. Doesn't matter. What I said earlier, get the photo without the people. That's the way you get around it. But just in terms of where are the lines? And I think if you have this, where would you then crop? Now, I'm mucking around here. At this point, if we sort of play around a little bit with this, and we kind of create our, again, playing with the rule of thirds. So we've got the sort of, this patch is sort of just running in the top patch. We've got a middle patch, and then we've got, and then this will be too big. So we would maybe bring that in, not that, just drag that in a little bit perhaps. We could play with it, doesn't really matter. But this is just to give you a rough idea. Maybe just pull that one back out actually. It's really about not, and tilting that a little bit so that again this patch here is slightly stronger, or straighter rather. And then I think that becomes a sort of slightly more interesting crop. We've then got, you can see the power of the diagonals in these beams becomes really strong, and then these feel like steps going down. Now we've got that crop. If I then rotate it back, I feel that that is maybe where there's an interesting shape. So the shape's in reverse obviously, but so let's go back to that, So if you're wondering where to crop from that, sometimes I think, okay, you went square, you sort of tried to move into the middle part of it, but I think there's this notion of, part of the problem is we see what we're expecting to see. And if you've got a sense of what you think is there, artists have this problem all the time, or when you're starting out with art all the time. For example, you see a postbox in Britain at any rate is red. Okay, so you know the postbox is red, so you paint it red. But the reality is, if you go up and look at that red postbox, it's lighter red where the light is hitting it on one side, it's darker red where it's in shadows on the other side. But then maybe there's a building which has got a blue frontage to it, which is, so there's bits of that blue reflecting in the red, and actually that red isn't there's very few places where it's actually really red. It's multiple shades and colours, but the brain knows it's red, and so it tells you it's red, so that's good enough. So sometimes, in order to really get to learn, get to paint something really interesting, we have to trick the brain. And same thing with photography. We need to break the brain from what it thinks it already knows, and literally just rotating or flipping the image, 180 degrees or whatever, suddenly makes it look quite different. Because it looks different, your brain suddenly goes, oh, I'm now looking at this in a different way, and you then crop it in a different way. Now, you might still prefer your original image. That's entirely up to you. All I'm trying to do here, Paul, is give you another way of thinking about it. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that gives you something to play with. So that's pretty much where we're at. What I would like to flip back here. If you found this interesting, if you found it useful, if you feel that you would like to help support these podcasts, buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres. I put the link into the comments. We're going to just click on it. It's not compulsory, but it is always appreciated. If you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe, and make sure you've got the little notifications bell on, and then each time I put up a new one of these, it will let you know. Basically, these go out live on a Tuesday evening, 7:30 UK time. So if you want to have that kind of sitting in with it, feeling as though you're in here with me, and being able to get into the questions, and leave comment, get a live interaction with me, then watching it live is always more fun with that. Obviously, if you can't make it live, but you're still interested in what I'm saying, I record all these, and then Tuesday, usually sometime around lunchtime, but certainly by late afternoon, it's up on Facebook on the Wednesday. I think that's pretty much about it. Yeah, if you are interested in putting it, please think about submitting your own images. You can see there are people who come back each week and put something, or periodically. If you've got your own photos and you haven't yet submitted, then do. This is an opportunity to get past our own blind spots, the bits you're stuck at, and hopefully I can kind of give you some insights and other ways of thinking about the way you're doing your photography to help you move to another level on it. And finally, next week I'm going to be looking at, I suppose we enter the world of cosplay in a way, really. I'm going to be talking about a Tomb Raider themed shoot I did, which was really a lot of fun. It was one of the early kind of stage narrative shoots I did, which also required learning how to make a flaming torch of the kind you see in movies. Something I'd never done before. So going to be talking about that. I think it could be a fun video. So anyway, enjoy the rest of your week, and hopefully see you next Tuesday for Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Thank you very much. Bye bye.